Hello viewers, today we are going to learn about consumer protection laws in detail from the chapter Consumer in the Market. Earlier in our class from the same chapter we had discussed about consumer and consumer problems, consumer and decision making and consumer aids for decision making. Now here today we are going to learn types of laws and the importance of these laws. A consumer can be defined as someone who acquires goods or services for direct use or ownership rather than for resale or use in production or manufacturing. Consumer interest can be protected by consumer protection laws and promoting competition in the markets, which directly and indirectly serve consumers and be consistent with economic efficiency. Consumer protection is a group of laws and organizations designed to ensure the rights of consumers as well as fair trade, competition and accurate information in the marketplace. The laws are designed to prevent businesses that engage in fraud or specified unfair practices from gaining an advantage over competitors. They also provide additional protection for those most weak consumers in the society. Consumer rights are the rights given to a consumer to protect him or her from being cheated by a salesman or a manufacturer. Consumer protection laws are designed to ensure fair trade competition and the free flow of truthful information in the marketplace. Consumer protection laws are a form of government regulation which aim to protect the rights of the consumers. Now, for example, a government may require a business to disclose detailed information about products, particularly in areas where safety or public health is an issue, such as food. Consumer protection is linked to the idea of consumer rights and to the information of consumer organizations which help consumers make better choices in the marketplace and get help with consumer complaints. Other organizations that promote consumer protection include government organizations and self-regulating business organizations such as consumer protection agencies and organizations, the Federal Trade Commission, ombudsmen, business bureaus, etc. Consumer protection can also be asserted via non-government organizations and individuals as consumer activism. There are different types of laws enacted in India and other parts of the world to protect the rights and interests of the consumers, producers and the marketeers. The laws will be amended depending on the current needs and situations in the local and national conditions. Now, following are some of the laws designed to protect the rights of the consumers, producers and marketeers. Now, let's see what are the types of laws. First, we have the Food Safety and Standards Act of 2006. This act is enacted to combine the laws relating to food and to establish the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India for laying down science-based standards for articles of food and to regulate their manufacture, storage, distribution, sale and import to ensure availability of safe and wholesome food for human consumption and for matters connected therewith or incidental thereto. Now, this Act aims to establish a single reference point for all matters relating to food safety and standards by moving from multi-level, multi-departmental control to a single line of command. To this effect, The Act establishes an independent statutory authority, the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India, with its head office in Delhi. Food Safety and Standards Authority of India, FSSAI, and the state food safety authorities shall enforce various provisions of the Act. Next, we have the Drugs and Cosmetics Act of 1940. The object of this Act is to regulate the import, manufacture, distribution and sale of drugs. Now, under this provision of the Act, the central government appoints the Drugs Technical Advisory Board to advise the central government and the state governments on technical matters arising out of the administration of this Act. The board can constitute subcommittees for the consideration of a particular matter. Next, we move on to the Pharmacy Act of 1948. The Pharmacy Act was passed in 1948 and was amended in 1959, 1976 and 1984. Now here, the aim of this Act is to regulate the profession of pharmacy in India. The state government has, under the provisions of the Pharmacy Act, to get a register of the state pharmacists prepared, and it is the State Pharmacy Council which has to maintain the register. The register shall contain the name and residential address of the pharmacist, the date of his first admission to the register, qualifications for registration, his professional address, the name of his employer and the prescribed particulars. Moving on, we now have the Drugs and Magic Remedies Objectionable Advertisements Act of 1954. This Act is meant to control the advertisements regarding drugs. It prohibits the advertising of remedies alleged to possess magic qualities and to provide for matters connected therewith. Next, we have the Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act of 1985. This is an act to consolidate and amend the laws relating to narcotic drugs to make stringent provisions for the control and regulation of operations relating to narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances and for matters connected therewith. Moving on, we have Food and Drug Administration Act. This is an act for strengthening and rationalizing the regulatory capacity of the Bureau of Food and Drugs by establishing adequate testing laboratories and field offices, upgrading its equipment, augmenting its human resource complement, and giving authority to retain its income. It is hereby declared a policy of the state to adopt, support, establish, institutionalize, improve and maintain structures, processes, mechanisms and initiatives that are aimed, directed and designed to A. Protect and promote the right to health of the people, and B. Help establish and maintain an effective health products regulatory system and undertake appropriate health manpower development and research responsive to the country's health needs and problems. Pursuant to this policy, the state must enhance its regulatory capacity and strengthen its capability with regard to inspection, licensing and monitoring of establishments and the registrations and of course, monitoring of health products. At present, the following acts and rules made thereunder that govern the manufacture, sale, import, export and clinical research of drugs and cosmetics in India. Next, we move on to the Standards of Weights and Measures Act of 1956. The Standards of Weights and Measures Act of 1956 was first enactment by which the uniform standards of weights and measures based on the metric system were established. The standards established by the 1956 Act were based on the international system of units. Standards of weights and measures were subsequently revised by having regard to the rapid advances made in the fields of science and technology and a practical system of units of weights and measures suitable for adoption for all the signatories to the Metro Convention was evolved. This practical system of weights and measures was given the name Lee System International D Units with its international abbreviation SI. Coming up next is the Standards of Weights and Measures Act 1976. An act to establish standards of weights and measures to regulate interstate trade or commerce in weights and measures and other goods which are sold or distributed by weights, measure or number, and to provide for matters connected therewith or incidental thereto. Now here, this act provides protection to consumers against malpractices of underweight and false weights. We now have the Trade and Merchandise Marks Act of 1958. The Trade and Merchandise Marks Act of 1958 provides for the creation of a trademark registrar, where an individual or firm could register the trademark in the office of Mumbai, Delhi, Kolkata, Chennai and Ahmedabad. This act provided with the ground of registration and refusal to register trademark. We move on to the Sale of Goods Act of 1930. The Sale of Goods Act is an act to define and amend the law relating to the sale of goods. It also governs the contracts relating to the sale of goods. The contracts for sale of goods are subject to the general principles of the law relating to contracts, that is, the Indian Contract Act. A contract for sale of goods has, however, certain specific features such as transfer of ownership of the goods, delivery of goods, rights and duties of the buyer and seller, remedies for breach of contract, conditions and warranties implied under a contract for sale of goods. Items not included in the term goods as defined by the Act are A. Actionable claims, B. Money, C. Sale of immovable property, because sale of immovable property is governed by the Transfer of Property Act, D. Labor, and E. Stocks, shares and securities. We now move on to Agricultural Produce or Grading and Market Act of 1937, which was later amended in 1986. Now, this act is formed to assure quality of agricultural products. This act provides great standards for agricultural commodities. The quality mark which is supplied by this act is AgMark. This mark is given only when goods are produced by following minimum standards. Whoever sells any scheduled article which is misgrade shall be punishable with imprisonment and fine. Next, we have the Prevention of Food Adulteration Act of 1954. This act is put into force to protect the public from poisonous and harmful foods, to prevent the sale of substandard foods, and to protect the interests of the consumers by eliminating fraudulent practices. Next, we have the Household Electrical Appliances, the Quality Control Order of 1981. Now, this order prohibits the manufacture, sale, etc. of household electrical appliances which does not conform to the rules of specified standards given in the Act. The Act shall not apply to manufacturers of household electrical appliances in respect of such appliances which are marked with ISI mark under a valid license issued under the ISI Certification Marks Act of 1952. Next, we move on to the Essential Commodities Act of 1955. The Essential Commodities Act of 1955 is a central act. It gives powers to control production, supply, distribution, etc. of commodities for maintaining or increasing supplies and for securing their equitable distribution and availability at fair prices. Under this Act, a number of control orders have been issued by the Government of India and state governments for regulating production, distribution, quality aspects, movement, etc. pertaining to the commodities such as food grains, edible oil, pulses, kerosene, sugar, etc., which are essential and administered by them. The central government monitors the action taken by the state governments to implement this Act. The control orders issued under this Act provide for action 1. To remove the stock seized, 2. To suspend or cancel licenses if any, and 3. Impose punishments like imprisonments. Next, we have the Prevention of Black Marketing and Maintenance of Supplies of Essential Commodities Act 1980. An act put into force to provide for detention in certain cases for the purpose of prevention of black marketing and maintenance of supplies of commodities essential to the community and for matters connected therewith. The Prevention of Black Marketing and Maintenance of Supplies of Essential Commodities Act 1980 is being implemented by the state governments or the Union Territories administrations for the prevention of unethical trade practices like hoarding and black marketing, etc. The Act empowers the central and the state governments to detain persons whose activities are found to be prejudicial to the maintenance of supplies of commodities essential to the community. Detentions are made by the states or the union territories in selective cases to prevent hoarding and black marketing of the essential commodities. Coming up next is an important act known as the Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act of 1958. An act to provide that the operation of the economic system does not result in the concentration of economic power to the common detriment, for the control of monopolies, for the prohibition of monopolistic and restrictive trade practices, and for matters connected therewith or incidental thereto. The Trademark Act of 1999. The Act prevents the use of fraudulent marks on products. Now, this Act is introduced in place of Trade and Merchandise Marks Act of 1958. The Bureau of Indian Standard Act of 1986. This Act is formed to provide special marks to products which fulfill some minimum quality standards. The common mark issued under this Act is an ISI mark. This Act has set up a grievance cell where a consumer can make a complaint about a product which is not up to a quality mark and are having ISI mark. The Consumer Protection Act of 1986. Now, the Consumer Protection Act came into force on July 1st, 1987. It provides enormous powers to consumers and consumer organizations against dishonest businessmen. The Consumer Protection Act seeks to provide speedy and inexpensive redressal to the grievance of consumers. It is designed to protect the rights and interests of the consumers. Consumer rights. The Act recognizes the following rights of the consumers: the right to be protected against the marketing of goods which are hazardous to life and property, the right to be informed about the quality, quantity, potency, purity, standard, and price of goods so as to protect the consumers against unfair trade practices. the right to have access to a variety of goods at competitive prices, the right to be heard and to be assured that the consumer interest will receive due consideration at appropriate forums, the right to consumer education, the right to seek redressal against unfair trade practices or unscrupulous exploitation of consumers. The Consumer Protection Amendment Bill of 2011. The government has introduced Consumer Protection Amendment Bill 2011 in Lok Sabha on December 16, 2011 to facilitate quicker disposal of cases and to widen and amplify the scope of some of its provisions of this Act. Next, we have the Competition Act of 2002. This Act is related to Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act of 1969. This Act is formed to encourage healthy competition and to protect consumers from companies which hamper competition. The Contract Act of 1982. This Act lays down the conditions in which promises made by parties to a contract will be legally binding on each other. It also lays down the remedies available to aggregate party if the other party fails to honor his promise. From the types of laws, we now move on to the importance of laws. 1. Protection from exploitation. Consumer protection laws are important to safeguard the consumer from exploitation. In the absence of consumer protection laws, consumers are exploited in many ways. Example, sale of unsafe products, adulteration and hoarding of goods, using wrong weights and measures, charging excessive prices, and sale of inferior quality goods, etc. Through various consumer protection acts, business organizations are under pressure to keep away from exploiting consumers. Consumer education. Consumer protection laws are helpful to create awareness among consumers about their rights and responsibilities and give them confidence to take legal action against companies or organizations who follow defaulted practices. Redressal of complaints. Importance of consumer protection laws is to present the consumer complaints in appropriate consumer courts and make sure that justice is done to consumers. Encouraging honest businessmen. Importance of consumer protection laws is to encourage the honest businessmen which will benefit consumers. Connecting link. Consumer protection laws acts as a link between consumers wanting to file complaints on one side and the business organizations that have defaulted on the other side and make sure that justice is done to final consumers. Unity. Consumer protection aims at bringing unity among consumers to fight collectively against the business organizations which include unfair trade practices. Consumers are encouraged to form cooperative societies so that the focus is on providing services to members rather than earning profit on the cost of the consumers. Quality life for the consumer. Importance of consumer protection is to aim at redressal of consumer complaints in an effective manner, but also on giving good quality life to consumers by business organizations that have defaulted on the other side and make sure that justice is done to the final consumer. Ethical obligations. Today, ethics play a prominent role in business. Business without ethical values is nothing but a criminal activity. Protecting the interest of the consumer includes absence of unfair business practices such as black marketing, profiteering, creating an artificial shortage, using wrong weights and measures, publishing false advertisements, etc. It is necessary for a businessman not to practice such uneven means, thereby protecting the interest of the consumer. Consumer protection laws helps to make a businessman follow ethics by giving some guidelines. To conclude, the importance of consumer protection laws is to safeguard consumers from any kind of exploitation from business organizations and ensuring the position of king of market to the consumer. Well, dear friends, I'm sure all of you are by now aware of the fact what are the consumer protection laws, the importance of these laws, and who a consumer is. As I mentioned, a consumer can be anybody. It includes all the citizens who are by and large the biggest group who are affected by the government, public or the private decisions. Hence, every consumer must learn to obtain information about goods and services, understand the psychology of selling and advertising, learn to shop wisely and distinguish between wants and needs to save his money. They must also understand the alternatives of conserving and saving rather than buying and consuming. Consumer rights awareness and knowledge on different consumer laws given by our government should become an integral part of our lives. And every consumer should make sure that they exercise their rights as consumers at some point in their daily lives so that they can safeguard themselves from the false practices which are happening in the market. Dear friends, I hope you enjoyed the chapter Consumer Protection Laws. Thank you.